Will, over to you, William Purves.
Hi, hopefully it's coming on.
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. Hi. So since last we talked, Tom, I have started reading My Big Toe, Volume 1. I'm actually up to chapter 19, so I'm just a little bit of the way in. I brought it with me on vacation when I was with Vanessa, and I started reading it. So I'm still kind of a neophyte. But I guess for me, it's interesting because I like a lot of the material, but I always kind of fall back into kind of a default area of like sort of scientific skepticism. And one of my heroes was always Carl Sagan, and I'm sure you're familiar with him and his Sagan standard of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I read a bit about the experiments that you did in the beginning with some of your colleagues. And I was wondering, I mean, and this is probably just my own ignorance, but is there like a section I'll get to at the back at the end when you guys talk about some of the experiments you ran and some of the evidence that you guys were able to find?
You mean from working at Monroe Laboratory?
Yeah.
No, there isn't anything in the back of the book that's going to do that. But that is not really, I wouldn't put that in the category of strong evidence. That's in the category of subjective. It's all subjective, and anything subjective is not very impressive to science or even to our logic. So no, I wouldn't base your understanding on trying to certainly it's not good for you to believe that the things that we talk about, the experiments and things that we did, whether you believe that or not believe it is irrelevant, and it won't help you grow up or evolve or anything else, whether you believe it or not believe it. So there's no benefit in believing it. You should stay skeptical until you get your own personal experience. So you being, like Carl Sagan says, Carl Sagan was a wise person. I agree with him. It takes, you have to have a lot of evidence to change someone's mind. So I think that with your own experience, as you read, you're just in the very beginning parts. It hasn't even gotten really serious yet. As far as understanding the nature of reality or consciousness. So you haven't gotten to the serious discussions yet. And the discussions get more serious as you go. Book 2 is more serious than book 1, and book 3 is takes it a little more serious than book 2. So stay skeptical. Don't look for ways to erase that skepticism. Skepticism is good. You don't want to erase that skepticism. You want to hang on to it. And stay skeptical always. You should only let that skepticism go as you have personal experience to the contrary. And as your own mind thinks about it and says, oh, this makes sense. This sounds good. This makes sense. When you think about it and it seems logical and makes sense to you, well, then take that I think of skepticism as really probability. Skeptical can be anywhere from, a probability of 0.5. Yeah, maybe it's like that. Maybe it's not, I don't know, about 50-50 to, 1,000,000 to 1. Absolutely not. That's just can't be true. Well, take that general probability curve that you have about things. And as you get more personal information, as you hear things and get arguments and think about things, and you start seeing things differently, that's not believing things differently, but seeing in your own mind, assessing things differently. Then you can modify that probability and say, well, that thing that was 1 in 100, I'm going to make that now 1 in 50. Now that I'm thinking about it this way, it seems like still it may not be so, but it's a little more plausible than it was. So you shift the probability around. And that's the way you need to go through those books. Hang on to your skepticism. And only when you feel like you have enough evidence, either logical or just personal experience, that's when you change those probabilities and become a little more or less skeptical of different things. Skepticism is good. And you should always be skeptical of everything, of course, that you read and hear. You should also be skeptical of yourself, your own thoughts, and we have to start with the premise that we're not omniscient. We don't know everything. There's lots of ideas out there that we've never even thought about yet. And we'll just see as we get to them and we think about them, we'll just see how we feel about that and whether it washes or not. And if it doesn't, well, we'll keep it in mind, but we'll go on and do some more investigating. So that, William, would be the way I'd say you should approach it. Not with, well, this stuff sounds kind of weird, but how could I believe that? Where's the proof? Well, there's never any proof. There's only evidence. Science doesn't work on proof. As Dean Radin says, he says, proof is for whiskey. Science runs on evidence, not proof. And science kind of came to that conclusion, after Newton's laws were seen not to be laws at all. They only work in a subset of our reality. They're not universal laws. They were thought to be universal laws. These will always be the truth. Well, science realized that when you start claiming you have universal laws that will be true forevermore, that's more arrogance than anything else. So now we have theories and we have evidence. We don't have laws anymore. And that's a much more rational way to approach science, and you should approach it the same way. So you don't have to give up any of your present understandings, any of your present attitudes or feelings or lack thereof, until you have something to the contrary that tells you that you need to change them. So that's the way I would say you go through it. So no, you're not going to get more proof that the things we did out at the lab were really that way. All you have is me telling you my experience. Okay, we did this and we did these kinds of things, and it was evidential, and the evidence piled up, and you can hear me say that, but that's just somebody saying it. And I would say, don't believe anything just because you hear somebody saying it, whether it's me or anybody else. It's not a good idea. You don't want to trade one belief for another belief. Just keep with whatever you've got until you've got information to the contrary. Information, good information, not just a story, but good information. So whether you kind of, I hate to use the word believe, but whether you believe or don't believe that the things we did at Monroe's lab, actually happened that way, or whether we just thought they did, it was just in our heads that we thought that that's what was going on, makes no difference. Whichever, it's just not important. So you're just in the beginning of the book, and don't take any of that first whole section too seriously. It's just a story about how I got as weird as I am. It's kind of the path I followed. And actually, I didn't even have that in the book for a while. And then somebody said, that I had to do that. I had to give a little biographical thing of, how did you, what's a nice physicist like me doing in a place like this? And so I went back and kind of put that in, but it isn't really an important part of the overall story. And whether you believe it or not, it's irrelevant. If I were you, just keep it in mind as, well, it's possible. It's possible that things happen that I just don't know about and that I've not experienced. I don't feel like I've experienced everything in the universe. So maybe not. Let's read on and see if there's anything else in here is more convincing. So that's what I would do. If I were you, I wouldn't be convinced by anything I read in book one, not at all. But I'd be open-minded enough that I'd say, well, possible. Maybe it happened just exactly like that. I don't know. Let me read more and get more experience and find out. And I do courses, and we've got one now coming out. It's very inexpensive. It's just all done by yourself. It's not with me. And I think it's just coming out probably in the next few weeks. And that is to help you experience some of the things that I experienced at the lab, experience them on your own, in your own way and in your own mind. And when you first experience these things, like remote viewing, and using your mind to affect other people's health, those kinds of things. When you first experience them, you still won't know whether it's just something, going on inside your head and you're just imagining it, or whether it's actually true. But eventually, with enough experience, you do know. You do get to a point that you understand that it's fundamental and it's real. But I didn't get to that point for a long time out there at the lab. I was right where you are right now for a long time at that lab. It wasn't until Dennis and I took that trip together. I don't know if you got to that part in the book or not, but Dennis and I took a trip, met out of body above the lab, and went off on an adventure together. And that was when it got to me at basically the gut level, at an intuitive level, that I knew what was going on was real, wasn't just somehow something going on inside my own head, and so I was making things up to fit. I was very skeptical of it for a long time. I was a couple of years into that. There's a big difference between intellectually understanding that you're remote viewing, because we obviously were. We were coming up with descriptions and they were right. But you still don't believe it at a deeper level, even though you're doing it. It stays in your intellect until you get to some point that it gets out of your intellect down at a deep level, and then it's real, and then you stop asking the question, is it real? But I asked the question, is it real, for a long, long time before I got to the point that I would give it up. And I think everybody should. Belief is just not useful. Belief won't take you anyplace important. So don't worry about it. No, there's not going to be anything later that's going to have some sort of proof. There isn't any proof. It's all just, where you hear me and you can read other sources where people are saying, this is what happened. Well, you can take that with a grain of salt. Anybody can say anything just happened. You don't know until you experience it. Then it becomes real to you after a long while, not even immediately after experiencing it. It's still not going to be real to you. You're still not sure, you're not just making it up somehow, but eventually you'll get there if you stay on the path. And when you do, you'll realize that reality is much bigger than the one you've been living in. And it has a lot more value to it than just the one you're living in. So even though it's a long path and it seems like maybe a flaky path in the beginning, I think you'll find, if you stay on it, that there's real value in it. But it may be a year or 2 years. Who knows how long it'll take before it becomes valuable to you. But I think it will in time. I think there's two things that you have to be. You have to be open-minded, which admits to possibility, and you have to be skeptical, which means show me. I've got to experience it. I have to understand it. Not just because somebody tells me, but I have to understand it in my own experience. So stick with that.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, wonderful. So Marco, I'm not sure if you're there. I know you had to leave early. If you want to ask your question now, you can. Otherwise, if you stepped away and you can't hear me and I'm talking to myself, then we're just going to go over to Sydney. Sydney, you're up.
Hi, Tom.
Hello, Sydney.
I so appreciate you and nice to see you. I think of you as an evolved guide for me. And but my question, and which is wonderful, why do there seem to be so few people, evolved kind of guides around, unless I'm not looking? Or it just seems like we all have different points of our evolution that we've come to, but there doesn't seem to me, in my experience, which is probably very limited, to be a lot of evolved guides. Where might they be?
First of all, there's probably not a lot, if you just talk about numbers, there's 7.5 billion of us, and the great majority are not very evolved. It's the quality of their consciousness. That just because they don't have any idea what the game is, so they don't work at it. They don't try. So their growth is very, very slow. But some of those that are evolved don't make a splash, don't really show up. And you'd never see them or notice them unless you knew them or met them. You know, they're the, what, I don't know, you know, the little old lady lives on the corner that comes out and smiles and says hello to all the children on the way to school, you know, or people who just are really nice and do good things for good people. So there's a lot of those around who are really very grown up, very evolved, but they just lead quiet lives. They're not yet into teaching on a large scale. They're just kind of consolidating their gains and their world. And they're just nice people who want to help. And they're just sweet people. And you run into those, not every other person you meet, but maybe every 100th person you meet is one of those. Just a really, really nice person. So they can be very high quality, but they haven't become public with their knowledge or their feeling. Now, they probably will with some time. They may do more teaching, but sometimes people will just kind of stay in that state where they are always positive. They connect with other people positively. And they're just a little bright light that shines, a good example for the rest of us. And that's an important role to play. So I think that's probably where most of them are. You won't notice unless you actually get to know them. And I suspect in your life, you run into people like that, just good people. So that's one thing. Otherwise, you know, when people begin this path, they begin mostly focused on themselves. They're growing. They need to grow up. They realize that they have fears and they have issues that need to be dealt with. So they work on that. And it's very self-focused, if you will. I wouldn't necessarily say self-centered so much, but self-focused on themselves and on their own growth. And they do that until they grow up to a point where they find that they understand enough that they can be helpful to others. Because until you've learned up to a certain point, you really can't be that helpful to others. So when you get to the point you can be helpful to others, then you start teaching more. And at first your teaching isn't getting up behind a lectern, it's just being a good example. And then eventually you get to where you do get up in front of the lectern, or you teach groups, or you open up some kind of school or lessons or something. And you work that, you know, maybe you become the Sunday school teacher or whatever, but you talk in a bigger space than just, you know, the dogmatic space. So that's kind of the step before you get to writing books and lecturing and talking to people in a bigger way. And some people just aren't into that. So they're around. But the real, you know, answer to your question is there really aren't that many of us. We are a small number out of the 8.5 billion, probably closer to 9, well, was it 7.5 billion? Yeah, around 8 billion people now, that there's probably only a very small percentage of that is fairly highly evolved. It's not a lot. Most people are still struggling with their fear. That's where most everybody is. So it's and many of the ones that are, you don't notice.
And I have another question. What is the point of random occurrence? So there's probability and there's also random distribution. What's the point of random occurrences?
The point of random occurrences is to basically stir the pot and create opportunities. So if there weren't any, then every opportunity would have to be planned. You know, it would have to be made if there wasn't anything random. But that would mean that somebody would have to be smart enough to know exactly how to make it. And that's not a good thing, because biases would come in, attitudes would come in, that wouldn't work out so well. So we have this, what I call social Brownian motion. Brownian motion is all the little particles, you put smoke in a jar, and you see that the little particles are just going every which way. They're all just bouncing around because they have collisions with each other, and they're as likely to move up as down or left as right. And it's just this random motion that keeps the jar full of smoke all the time. The smoke doesn't just settle to one corner. It's constantly stirred up by the motion. Well, that's called Brownian motion. And I see that in a social metaphor. That's the way we are. We're all interacting with each other, affecting each other, and changing each other, giving each other opportunities. And all of that is kind of random. It just happens as it happens. And that randomness creates a lot of our opportunities, because it creates interactions that nobody would think to create. It's way more complexity than somebody would be in charge of doing it all. It would be much more simple-minded and not nearly as rich with diversity if you just let that randomness stir the pot and create opportunities.
Good answers. Thank you.
Yeah, really good answer. Great question too, Sydney. Tom, just to kind of, you mentioned that a lot of people who are not evolved, and it's a tiny percentage, what, like 1 or 2% of that 8 billion?
I didn't say. just very small. I don't know. Just very small.
All right. And you mentioned a lot of them don't go on to teach or
well, not in a big way. What I meant to say is that they don't go on to teach in a way that you would notice. Okay, now they may teach in a small way. In other words, they may have their own ashram someplace on a mountaintop, and they may have 20 or 30 or 40 people that hang out at their ashram that are their, well, I don't know, it depends on the organization, but their followers, their devotees, their whatever. And they may teach in that environment. They may teach small groups of people and continually. And so they may be teachers, but you wouldn't notice them. You don't know that they even exist because you're not in that culture. So there are many like that don't show up. And then there's many just good examples. Like I said, the nice people who don't show up. So the only ones that really show up are the ones that make a bigger splash. They have followers in the thousands rather than in 10 or 20. And they write books, and they make videos, and they get public, they go have meetings, and those are the ones that you see. And out of those, probably, a half to 2/3 of them are just slick talkers that, are trying to make money. They're not even the real thing. There's somebody just posing because they know there's a need for that, and they can make money at it. So there's some of those that are real, though. So it depends. They're teachers, somebody they just may be very obscure. They write a book, and 1,000 people read the book, but you'll never hear of them, even though maybe it's a good book. So there's that going on, that kind of teaching going on. So if we take all of that into account, then there's a pretty significant number of people who are teaching, but you're just thinking of the ones that stand out, the ones that have large groups of followers or whatever. How many of those that are genuine? Well, there's not a lot. There's not a lot. It's not like there's tens of thousands of those. There's, you count those, 10 or 20 or something like that, which is not much for a world of, 8 billion people.
And those ones that stay quiet, you mentioned like the little old lady on the corner who says hello to all the kids. Wouldn't those ones be nudged to share more and to help more?
Oh, yes. And they share and help everywhere they can. and they're all peace and light. And that's very helpful to people, just to run into a little peace and light. So yes, they are helpful, but just in their own little small area of acquaintances, sort of like the guru that's maybe on the mountaintop, and it's just that group of acquaintances and people that know of him that they help.
Sibrant, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, I had another question, but the conversation before, I was always wondering, or I was thinking about intelligence versus intellect. And I was always been wondering about that. I came in this world as a right brain, and when I went to school, I was not very good. I was thinking, oh, I'm not intelligent and everything. But now I'm growing up and thought about it, and I think that intelligence has more to do with the quality of your consciousness, and intellect is more, I think these two terms are being mixed up a lot by a lot of people. But they think that intelligence, that people who are very intellectual and very smart, like our leaders or like scientists, but their intelligence is usually very low, because if you really think about it, that what is intelligence? And intelligence has something to do with knowing that love and cooperation is the only answer, and that is where we have to go. And our leaders and scientists, they more look at the intellectual side. They have to make sense of things, you know, and they don't act out of their being level. And that's why our collective consciousness is pretty low, and we choose our leaders out of the collective. So our leaders are not very intelligent in my eyes, because if you look how the world functions these days, and has been for the last 200,000 years, really, as a warlords and fighting, and a child, a teenager knows that cooperation is the way to go. It's so logic, and I always see that the big picture is so simple. It's, you know, William Ockham is one of my inspirations too. The simplest solution is usually the right one.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, yeah, Tom, do you agree with me that
Yeah.
intelligence has to do something with the quality of the consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. The difference, another way of stating the same idea, is that we all know the difference between knowledge and wisdom.
Right.
You know, you can have lots and lots of knowledge. You can have tons of knowledge, like many scientists and other people do. They specialize and have heaps of knowledge in a very particular area, but that doesn't confer wisdom. Wisdom is gained in other ways. Wisdom is gained by understanding how things connect, understanding big pictures, not little pictures. So yes, there are many people that have much knowledge but little wisdom. There are many people that have little knowledge and little wisdom. And there's some that have little knowledge but lots of wisdom. You know, the two are not really that strongly correlated. They're two different kinds of things. And I've often kind of been amused by the descriptions of some people when they talk about, oh, so-and-so's a genius. You know, he's a genius. He's so smart that he's a horrible teacher, you know, but he does great research, but, you know, he's a terrible teacher in a classroom. And I think that no, he's not a genius. You know, he's not that intelligent. He just knows a lot of stuff and a lot of details about stuff, but otherwise he'd be a good teacher, because he'd relate to those children. He'd relate to the kids. He'd relate to his ability to impart knowledge to them. And that would be important to him. But if he's so wrapped up in his own work that he just doesn't have time for students at their insignificant low level, then he's not all that intelligent and certainly not a genius. He just has a lot of knowledge in a particular space. And he also would seem to be pretty self-centered, which would indicate not very grown up. But you hear that a lot about people. Well, he's so smart, he can't even, put the same color socks on. They make jokes about Einstein. Einstein would forget to get off, in his streetcar that would take him to his house. Somebody would have to tell him, Albert, it's time for you to get up and leave now. Otherwise, he'd just sit on there and go around again, because he was just such a genius that he was stupid. Well, that's not the case. If you read much of his work, you'll see somebody who did have a big picture, somebody that did care and wasn't just wrapped up in himself and his details. The fact that he could focus so well that he wasn't paying attention to the things that weren't important to him, like where his stop was, well, that didn't make him stupid. That just made him somebody who could focus very deeply on things and who separated in his mind the things that were important to him and the things that weren't. But anyway, we have a very poor understanding of genius and smart and brilliance and intelligent and all of that. But you're right, there's two different things going on there. And we're starting to get a little better. It used to be all intelligence and IQ. And of course, our measurements of IQ are not really measurements of intelligence. They are a measurement of something, but it's not really, it's more maybe intellectual capacity that they're measuring rather than anything that should be associated with intelligence. But now we talk about emotional IQ. Also there's intellectual IQ and there's emotional IQ and then there's spiritual IQ. And, we're thinking about there's different capacities that people have in lots of different ways and that they're all important. The intellectual part is not the only part of us that's significant and that's important. So we're beginning to have a bigger picture about that. But in general, yes, I agree with you. Wisdom is something far apart from just knowledge. And you can be very knowledgeable and not be wise at all. And you can be very intellectual and miss out on almost all the important things in your life, because most of the important things in life take place on the intuitive side. They're the subjective things. The subjective world is where the richness of life is. It's where the color of life is. It's where most of the meaning of life is. And over on the intellectual side, that is kind of sterile and barren compared to the subjective side. So people who live their entire lives and their entire reality is cast only on the intellectual side, well, they are missing an awful lot. They're only experiencing a small part of what there is to experience. And that's a shame, but our culture supports that. Our culture gives rewards to people who are very successful intellectually and doesn't reward people who are successful intuitively. It gives rewards to people who can do things and make things happen, does not particularly give rewards to people who care and organize and are helpful. I mean, it does in some ways, but just I'm talking very generally. What the culture tends to see high value, and what it sees as nice, but not that important. So yeah, it's just the culture that we live in. But there's many people who only live in their intellects, and they're logical process people. And unfortunately, for them, they miss out on a lot of the richness and significance of life. Now, not all of them. There's many who are balanced, who have both, but there are quite a few who live entirely on the intellectual side, because that's the side their culture honors and approves of and pays for, it values. And those people, if you ask them, do they have emotions and do they have feelings and do they have other things? And most of the time they would say yes. Some of the ones more deep would say no, I don't have any of those things. But most people would say, of course, they have those things. But that part of their life is not rich. It just kind of happens to them. It's all random sort of things that take place. It's not really a core important part of their life. It's just that other part that happens on the way in their intellectual space. It happens off on the side, but doesn't have a lot of meaning to it, which is very unfortunate, because that's where most of life's most important meaning comes from. It's not intellectual. It's both intuitive and it's subjective. Subjective information is the stuff that is where our feelings come from, for the most part. It's where go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly note, we are at the top of the hour, at the 3-hour mark. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Linda still has a question too. I don't know if we can fit that in.
We can always fit in a question from Linda.
Okay. Well, why don't, Brandt, are you okay if we go over to Linda's question now? Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Linda, you're up.
Okay. So thank you. Recently on one of the Facebook groups, somebody was asking about jealousy, and I went and searched the video search tool for that term, and only came back with one result, and it wasn't pertaining to human jealousy. In fact, it was Tim Murphy discussing God's jealousy. So maybe you've already talked about it, Tom, as a human emotion, and I just haven't seen that video yet, but I was hoping you could just riff a little on human jealousy, and I'm sure it's an artifact of fear and ego, but just so we can get it into the video search tool as a topic.
Okay, well, jealousy is just one way that fear can express itself. It's also tied very much with insecurity. People who are insecure see that bit of security that they have threatened, tend to get jealous. Jealous being that, no, they don't want that change, or they have needs, particular needs and wants. And of course, these are my needs, my wants. It's all very self-focused and self-centered. And they see that their situation that solves their needs and wants, or that meets their needs and wants, is being threatened. And often that's the result of jealousy, or that somebody else has more than they have. And if you feel insecure and inadequate, you don't like other people to have more security or more whatever than you have, because their success reminds you of your lack of success. Therefore, this person who is very accomplished, you have jealousy about that because you're not so accomplished. And then that gets in turn interpreted in your own mind as failure, not as good as you should be. And if you have this fear of being inadequate or not being good enough, then that just resonates with that fear and creates a strong emotion. So jealousy is just another way that fear can express the fear. There's lots of ways that fear can express itself. Anger is one way that fear expresses itself. Self-pity is a way that fear expresses itself. And jealousy is just another way that that fear can express itself. So it's not a very pretty thing, Yeah, but it's somebody who feels themselves either threatened or inadequate. And they're jealous that somebody else has something they want and that they don't have it. That's being inadequate. And of course, what they will say is, why, that person shouldn't have that. I'm more deserving than they are. You see, they come up with this, and that's their ego trying to tell them, you're all right. You're just fine. That's what the ego is good for, is to tell you that your fear isn't really there. Or they're jealous of somebody else taking their loved one away from them, or that kind of stuff, or taking more time away from them. And they get jealous because they're not getting as much as they want or they need. So it's all very self-focused, and it is a low quality of consciousness attribute, but it's one that's very common that a lot of people experience off and on. It's probably pretty common, but there are some that get extreme with it. Sometimes people get extremely jealous, and then it gets dysfunctional. But there's lots of jealousies that are not really all that dysfunctional. People just kind of covet what other people have. They want this or want that. And if they didn't feel insecure and unworthy, they wouldn't feel the jealousy. So at the root of that jealousy is somebody who doesn't feel very good about themselves. They don't feel as competent or as worthy as they would like to. And that's kind of the fear that then triggers jealousy.
And if they were secure, they could maybe be happy for that other person rather than jealous.
Yes, if they were secure in themselves, then they would be glad that this other person got the promotion. That's fine. Well, I'll get one, someday. I'm doing all right where I am. I'm not, I don't have to be the winner in the spotlight. I'm doing fine. I'm okay. Or that other person, is taking my girlfriend or boyfriend away, that you are self-secure, and you would say, well, that's all right. That they'll either come back or they won't. But in any case, I'll do fine. Yeah. If they don't come back, well, that's probably good. Then good. I hope they have a good life, and my life will probably be better too, because I only want to be with people who want to be with me. You see,
Yes.
so it, if you're secure, then there's jealousy just doesn't occur. Like most things, when people are acting badly, whether they're in self-pity or whether they're angry or dominating or just whatever their negative behavior is, it almost always goes back to a person feeling insecure and not good enough. People are negative when they don't like themselves, when they're not satisfied and not comfortable with themselves. That lack of self-comfort is what gets them upset and angry and jealous. And that negativity that they feel toward themselves, they express and throw out, they project, I guess would be the word, on others. You make me feel bad, you are ruining my life. Well, you ruin your own life for the most part. If your life comes to hardship and you are well evolved, it's just another challenge. It's not ruinous. It's just another challenge that will be maybe more fun than the last one. So all of the negativity comes down to really self-disapproval, self-dislike, being too demanding or too much. You expect too much from self. And if you're not the best, or if you ever make a mistake, it's upsetting. A need to be perfect. All of those things just come from a sense of inadequacy. So when you see people that are acting poorly and are acting very negatively, it's about a 90% chance that at the root of that is they don't really like themselves very much. They're not very satisfied with who they are. They find themselves wanting. And that is the problem. And the anger and the negativity and the lashing out, that's just how they deal with or cover up their own negative feelings toward themselves. That's how they pretend that that negative feeling isn't there. They cover it over with lashing out to others. So in that way, you can have more empathy for people who are being negative and acting out. You know, you can kind of look at them and say, well, those people are not really happy. They don't really like themselves. They're very unhappy at a fundamental place. And that lets you feel, you know, concern for them and not be so angry back. How dare you get angry? You know, and now you have this person's ego, you know, fighting with that person's ego. And all of that's just very destructive. But when you see people who are negative, these are people who are generally unhappy, and they're unhappy because they don't like themselves. They're not happy with themselves.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for staying extra to be able to answer that for me.
Oh, Linda, you've stayed extra and put in extra hours so many times for me and for the things that I'm doing that I couldn't do any less. You deserve that and more. Thank you.
And a very happy holiday season to you and Pamela, and a very happy birthday to you, Tom.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our newly created Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.